Hi, everyone. As we populate the session, I just want to introduce myself and our panelists. My name is Dana Howard, and I'm a member of the Center for Bioethics and the Philosophy Department at at OSU, at The Ohio State University. And welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values monthly CARE panel. The CARE program is presented with support from the OSU UMC Center for Bioethics and the Clinical and Translational Science Institute. We are so happy to have you on this very special collab with Ohio State University Libraries to kick off their Love Data Week. And there's a lot of really exciting programming that is happening throughout the week at Ohio State. And we're sharing a link to the other events, both virtual and in person, that you can check out. So today, oh, and I also wanted to just thank Kelsey Badger, whose leadership helped plan all this, and also Sally Moore, who is the administrative mastermind behind all of this stuff. So thank you, the two of you. So today's panel touches upon an increasingly difficult challenge that many researchers are facing, how to approach missing data, and also how to approach data that is disappearing or data sets that may be biased. So what ethical obligations arise when the data we need isn't available, may never have existed, and what sorts of collaborations can we engage in with communities to help preserve and reimagine data that is at risk of disappearing, and also support and protect them with the sort of potential elevated risks that come with data collection. And we're delighted to have four panelists, five panelists? No, four panelists. Four panelists today. And our external panelist who's going to start us off is Jennifer LaFleur, who's an assistant professor of data journalism at the College of Journalism at University of California in Berkeley. Jennifer is a data journalist, editor, and longtime teacher of data journalists. And joined Berkeley in August 2023. Formerly, Jennifer was a senior editor at the Center for Public Integrity, an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit newsroom that focuses on investigating inequality. And Jennifer's journalism career includes serving as the director of data journalism at ProPublica, and also had similar roles at the Dallas Morning News. So welcome, Jennifer. Jennifer is going to kick us off for 15 minutes to just sort of give us the lay of the land of some of these ethical issues and the challenges. And then we're going to have our OSU experts come in and share their own experiences, challenges, and practice. We have joining us Sarah Hayford, who is a professor of sociology and also the director of the Institute for Population Research at Ohio State University. Sarah studies family formation and reproductive health, primarily in the United States and sub-Saharan Africa. And as the director of the Institute of Population Research, Sarah also can connect OSU researchers at OSU's Federal Statistics Research Data Center, which is a really amazing resource managed by the U.S. Census Bureau that is one of the centers is housed at OSU. We also are going to have Joshua Sidvari, who's the geospatial information librarian at OSU. Joshua supports researchers at OSU by connecting them with appropriate geospatial information resources and helps them effectively use this kind of important data in impactful ways for their scholarship. And finally, we have Rebecca Andridge, who is the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies and professor in biostatistics, in the College of Public Health at OSU. And Dr. Andridge's research is focused on analytic methods for missing data, primarily when missingness is driven by missing values themselves. So I think we can see we have just a wealth of expertise at OSU, and also with Jennifer. I'm so excited about this conversation that we're about to have. So why don't we kick us off with Jennifer, and then we'll take the conversation from there.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so this is such an interesting project and week, and hopefully I can dip back into some of the other things you're offering this week. And I'm really interested to hear what everybody else has to say. I also serve on our campus-wide library committee, so I'm going to tell them about this. So maybe we can do something next year. So I'm going to share my screen and go through some slides. I'm kind of focusing on how journalists use data and how we handle missing data and some of the stories where it's been an issue for me and how we've handled it. But I'm looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panels have for solutions. Apologize, I'm getting over a cough, so trying not to cough during this, but if I do, I apologize ahead of time. Great, I'm gonna make sure my sound is shared. Okay, great. So we, as journalists, analyze data for many different stories: local crime data, national data, international accountability stories. There's a specialty of called data journalism, which is sort of a weird name, but that tends to be journalists who do bigger data analysis stories, accountability stories, and investigative stories based on data. I just got done judging an international data journalism contest, and there's so many amazing stories that have been done in the last year. And in nearly every case, the data, as most of you probably know, are flawed. And part of the reporting process for us, which I drill in with my students, I tell them if like you learn nothing else, figure out how to find holes in your data because all the other stuff somebody can teach you, but finding flaws and managing them. So our approach is to approach your analysis as a critic. Sometimes what happens in a newsroom, we like find some data and then we get so excited that we don't want problems to be in it because we think we have this great thing. But the most important thing we can do is to approach the analysis as a critic. Look at what other problems have been encountered by other journalists, by experts. What are you not thinking about? What else might explain your findings? What holes are there in their data? And then we do what we call interviewing your data. Just like any source you would interview, they have flaws and you have to do a background check. We have to do the same thing with data. So just a couple of quick examples. This is a story from several years ago, which reported that this one town in Kansas had the highest traffic to pornography websites. And their explanation is kind of silly, but what happens with mapping, and we have someone from geospatial data here, is if your mapping program can't find the place it goes, it puts it right in the middle of the county, in the middle of the state, in the middle of the country. And so all of these IP addresses got coded to the middle of the country. And it wasn't that those addresses were in that city. It just happened that they weren't geocoded properly and they all got put in the middle of Kansas. So, but I love their like explanation, the vagaries of IP-based geolocation. So, another one. 525,600 minutes, 525,000 moments, oh dear, 525,600 minutes. I love the story because and it was so fun to see. They calculated the beginning of the first performance of Rent and how many minutes it was to go with one of the songs in the performance. Unfortunately, they forgot about leap year. And so their calculation, which was so clever, had to be redone. So those are the things like, what am I not thinking of? Where's somebody going to poke a hole in this? So some of the standard data checks we do, which I'm sure many of you do as well, what's the source of the data? And, it's great that communities and states and everybody have data portals. But I have had so many instances where like a community's data portal, there's data there, but it's not the best data. And so I always myself go back to the originating primary source or make my students call the primary source to see if the data on the portal is the correct data. We were working on a project in one newsroom I worked in where the reporters were analyzing the data and they weren't getting similar results to some of the annual reports that the agency produced. And so, they called the data folks at the agency who said, oh, the data on the website, that's the bad data. We'll give you the good data. So always, always, always try to find those things. How many records should you have? It's simple, but oftentimes, and I'll talk about a few examples, you don't get all the records. Is data missing? This is a key to what we're looking for. Are there duplicates? Are there consistency issues? I'm so sorry. Is the data within reasonable ranges? So if you have data with ages in it, does it make people like too young or too old to even be in the data? Are there any internal checks you can do? I am so sorry. Um, for example, if you have school data, are there more teachers than students in a school? And just gut checking and seeing, does this seem right? If you think it isn't, it probably isn't. So, a couple of silly things that we run into is Excel. Excel has a maximum of a little over 1 million rows. And oftentimes we're working with data with more than that. Old Excel has only about 65,000 rows per worksheet, and some agencies still use it. This was from the COVID tracking data in the UK. The agency tracking the COVID data was using an old version of Excel, which meant they cut off thousands and thousands and thousands of rows of data because their Excel program couldn't hold it. Beware of numbers that look too perfect or too round. So this is a UK site where you can only download 5,000 records. So if I were to download it, it'd be a problem because I might not have all the data. Is data missing? So this is what we're focusing on today, holes in the data. Oftentimes the first step for me is to read the fine print. This is FBI data, and if you look at the fine print, it tells you that only 15,000 of 18,000 participating agencies submitted crime data. So you have to know what's left out, what's not in there, because if you're doing an analysis and portraying something as being, the whole country, you'd be wrong, and you'd be giving readers wrong information. This other chart is Alameda County, where Oakland is based, campaign spending data, and we'll often just do a quick tell me for every field how much data is missing. And sometimes it's a problem, sometimes it's not. It might be that, in their documentation, in their metadata, they explain, this field is not filled out every time, and here's why. But you need to figure out what that is. And just a gut check, if something doesn't seem right, it probably isn't. So this is from one of my students last summer who pulled data for all 311 service requests, all 311 calls for a very long period of time, and they found 1.2 million records. And again, I'm like, I think there's probably more than that in there. So do a shorter time period and see what's in like a 6-month time period. And what happened is they were using a program that was cutting off their data and they didn't have everything. Beware of hidden missingness. Oftentimes agencies will code missing data as things that look like values. So this is school data from the Department of Education, and they code their missing data as -9. That's because oftentimes computer programs need to have a value, and so they put a value in that isn't, anything that would ever be used. But if you don't know that and you're going in and analyzing it or adding things up, you could really get into trouble. What data is missing? Sometimes it's just a little things here and there. Is it entire records? Is it entire fields? How much is missing? So you really kind of need to do an analysis of the missingness. Like, first of all, what am I dealing with? And then why is it missing? I always try to go back to the agency or the source of the data and find out if they can tell me what issues might be in the data. If there's metadata or documentation that it might explain that. that can be helpful as well. And then if the data is audited, and many government agencies, their data gets audited, going back to some of the audit reports of the data can be really helpful. I don't actually use it as much anymore, but GAO, for example, the Government Accountability Office, used to do analyses of different data that gets reported and the problems in it. So would reporting all the data be unethical? So here we're getting into the ethics of what to report and what not to report. And, we have to think about that all the time. Are we giving our readers something that is truthful? In this day and age, facts that are solid and provable are really important. Is it possible to fill in missing data? I'll go through some examples about this. What transparency measures should you include in your report? Are there experts who can provide insight? Are there standards to follow? Is there a pattern to the missingness? And is there an alternate source of the data, which is one thing we'll often do. Data gets reported to a county and then a state and then the federal government. So going back to one of the other levels can sometimes fill in information. So this is one I saw the other day. It's vaccination rates and measles cases. And what I thought about immediately was there's a lot of holes there. And is it better to report what we have than not report it at all? So on this one, I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I would love to hear what other people think about that. Missing data can portray false patterns, especially with mapping, because we often take addresses and send them through a process called geocoding, which places them on a map. And I had a reporter I'm working with at an outlet the other day say, well, there's 600 that didn't geocode. Can't I just ignore them? No, because those 600 might be in a concentrated place that's particularly hard to map, or a place that just had like new development. And so the addresses aren't in the geocoding tools. And so this one, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, if I didn't have all those crimes plotted, I'm really portraying something false because the previous map showed a cluster down there. So we have to think about, like, are we portraying false information to our readers? I worked on a project at ProPublica several years ago looking at the opportunity gap. So access to advanced courses, AP courses. And we found some really extreme outliers. I think at the time there were like 50 AP courses that could be offered, and we had schools offering 1,400. I think someone's zero key probably got stuck. So that reporting did lead to the Civil Rights Office revamping how it gathered the data, but it also, showed us some of the ways we have to address it. So anything that looked, after talking with the researchers there, they said anything that is out of this range, they gave us a range, you probably need to double check. So we went back to the original sources, the schools, the districts, to try to fill in holes. But we also gave any reader, or which could include schools and districts, the opportunity to come back to us and correct information. We disclose that we don't know that we caught everything, and we want your feedback to make it even better. And that's something I think can be really valuable for newsrooms, to elicit feedback to make things better. So this is truck accident data in Texas, year over year. And I always tell my students, I don't think it means that Houston got super safe in the last year. What happened is Houston wasn't properly reporting its data. The state didn't like how it reported it, so they just weren't counting it. And so some of the holes we can find by looking at things, by breaking them down by place, looking at things year over year. And so that missing data, we ended up having to go back to the cities that were missing data and fill in the extra information, and obviously share with readers that we had to do this because the original data wasn't correct. This is one area where I really love when agencies audit data. So the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, I got that acronym right, audits data quality that it gets from states. And so this is really helpful if you're trying to understand like what problems might be in my data, what holes might be there. This is Maryland, for example, and then Ohio. And so it rates on all these accuracy, completeness, the quality of the data, which is helpful as a data user to see what I'm dealing with. And I wish, we'd see more of this. I think we'll probably see less of this from the federal government, but opportunity for states as well. So one of my projects is something called the Accountability Project. We have gathered about 2 billion public records to make them searchable for, especially small newsrooms that don't have access to a lot of research tools. But for every data set, we do a rigorous data cleaning. We post the code for our data cleaning and what we found so that sorry, so that users know exactly what they're getting when they use the data. And this is just one of the reports that we include with every single data set. And this is the one with the missing data. So we look at every field and what is missing. This is a project I worked on at ProPublica many years ago, looking at racial bias in presidential pardons. And so we often in projects where you do a more complex analysis, newsrooms will publish a white paper laying out your findings, and in there we lay out what problems we had with the data, what approaches we went to the data. That's also something that we use before a project ever gets published. We'll often send that to experts to vet the analysis and get their feedback. And oftentimes it's very helpful because we'll have folks say, well, you might think about adding these other variables to your model. But we always try to disclose what problems we found in the data and how we handled them. This is the markup, which is a newsroom that focuses on algorithmic bias. This project looked at racial bias in mortgage data, and they again did a white paper disclosing everything they knew and everything they didn't know. This is an example of sometimes we know there's holes in data and that there's more records that likely exist, but reporting what it does exist is really important. So this is a project we worked on at the Center for Public Integrity called 40 Acres and a Lie, where we explored the program called, you might have heard 40 Acres and a Mule. That was a program that allegedly really never came about. Nobody got any land or anything like that. It just was a promise that never happened. We were able to identify hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families that got land titles and track them. We spent 2 years looking through using some machine learning tools to look through Freedmen's Bureau's records and find things like this here is the very first land title that we ever found, so that we could track them. And then we also worked with genealogists to find living descendants. So this was a case where we know more exist. There's more land records out there. We just, we at some point we had to stop, and this is what we had at the end. But we're also, providing opportunities for others to continue this research too. Raiders did a project last year looking at famine. And, some of the ways they had to estimate data, they didn't have a database of every single incident, but they were able to use things like satellite imagery to find grave sites and other ways where, especially in countries where there's no data, there's no public data, using some of these tools like satellite imaging and things like that can be really powerful to try to at least estimate data. And sometimes missing data is the story. So this is the New York Times piece where they looked at missing inspection records for nursing homes. This was published, I think, pretty much still in the midst of the pandemic, and really important to know what is missing from the data, as well as that there is missing data. And in there, many people were not seeing lapses in infection control, sexual assault in nursing homes because of the appeals process within the system. This is a recent story from Marketplace looking at how many government data sets have been cut. I put the link in the presentation too, which I can share with anyone, but there's data sets that we rely on that just aren't there anymore. And what I try to remember is like every single one of the records in these data sets is a person or a neighborhood or, a payment. So when we lose that, we lose like whole populations of important ways of understanding our communities and having oversight over, holding government agencies accountable. So what our recommendations are, and they make my students do, is to know the flaws in your data and disclose them. Any data story my students do, they have a whole little checklist they have to go through, checking their data, include any caveats in your reporting. And I think it's really important to get them in the habit of knowing that just because there's problems in your data, doesn't mean that you can't report with it, but you do need to disclose that. For complex analyses, consider doing a white paper so you're very transparent about what you've done. And verify your approach with experts, especially topic experts, because you're looking at a specific topic. I'm so sorry. They're going to have insight in how to look at that best. And provide opportunities for subjects and reader feedback. I think that's really important. I think we need to continue to connect with communities and engage communities with our data, and also use them to help gather data in cases where we can't get it another way. So that's all I have, and I apologize for my coughing, but yeah, thanks. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And so we're going to go through and just some preliminary remarks from our OSU faculty. And one thing that I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there should be a Q&A button. So feel free to start asking questions throughout, and we're going to get to them in the course of the conversation. All right, Sarah, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I would love to kick us off. So I'm Sarah Hayford. As Dana said, I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Population Research. As a data user, I mostly use quantitative data from surveys and administrative data sets. I've also done some qualitative data collection with in-depth interviews. I've done some survey data collection, so I'm both a producer and a user of data. And I want to talk today with my demographer hat on. Many people may not have a very strong idea of what demography is. My PhD is actually in demography. And we have a sort of an identity as a field that's very much connected to data, to the process of the production and use of data, and to understanding the ways that all data are incomplete, full of missingness, and probably biased. So demography as a field is the study of populations, population characteristics and compositions, what makes populations grow and shrink. And demography as a field kind of grew up alongside and in response to, I mean, broadly, you could say the development of the nation state and the interest of governments in understanding their populations and measuring their populations. And so that's a kind of separate ethical conversation of how do you think about a field that was developed to serve a specific set of interests that aren't always academic interests. So a couple things about demography. It is the study of populations. I don't want to get too much in the weeds about methods, but it's a field that doesn't rely on inferential statistics. So it's not the idea that you get a sample of a small group of people and you extend from that sample to a population. The idea of demography is you have information on the whole population. And of course, we know that in reality, we don't always have information on a whole population. We're always going to be missing someone. So demographers are very aware of that fact. But I think our methods towards missing data are more like what Jennifer talked about of interviewing your data. I really like that phrase. So trying to understand what data are saying and what data are not saying. And so I want to talk specifically about kind of two ways that demography has kind of evolved methods to think about missing and incomplete data. So one is maybe the sort of height of demography's power and influence as a field was in the middle of the 20th century during the kind of period of development of new states after colonization, after decolonization in the global South. And so this was a place where demographers were trying to measure things without administrative data. So trying to measure things that the state was interested in without state capacity to collect data. So if you think about, you want to measure a death rate, you need the number of deaths and you need the number of people. It's the number of deaths divided by the number of people. In the United States, deaths are registered at the government level. We have a census that counts the number of people. So we have sort of formal administrative records of those things. In places without a lot of state capacity, you don't have complete measures of those things. So how do you think about measuring death rates where you don't have reliable counts of either deaths or population? Demographers have a whole set of methods that we call indirect estimation methods, which are sort of about asking your friends about whether, sort of how many people do you know that have died, and extrapolating from that sort of triangulation, trying to get at multiple reports of things that are going on and bring those reports together. The other thing that demographers do sort of around missing and incomplete data is that demographers, are also social scientists and are also interested in social processes and social lives and social realities. And in a lot of cases, those social realities move faster than the administrative data collected to record them. So my PhD is from 2005 when I was being trained in the early 2000s. One of the things that demographers were really focused on was how do we measure cohabitation? We know cohabiting relationships are socially important. The census, federal statistics don't measure these things yet. How do we ask people, are you living with someone that you're in a romantic partnership with? Can we sort of infer it from data that weren't designed to collect this relationship? Are there better and worse ways of inferring, sort of more and less reliable ways that better capture social reality? I can talk about some, same-sex relationships. There's the same process. A sort of maybe less politically charged example is in trying to understand step families and families that are spread across households when all of our data collection is focused on households. I will stop there and happy to talk more about any of this and answer any questions that people have.
Thank you, Sarah. Joshua, do you want to go next?
Thanks. And thanks for having me today. Hi, everyone. My name's Josh Sidvari. I'm the Geospatial Information Librarian. I work with students, researchers from any level, from any discipline, who are interested in using geospatial data, conducting spatial analyses, making maps. And so these are folks who are developing expertise or are experts in their field, but might have really varying levels of familiarity with spatial data. And so a lot, Jennifer, of what you were saying really resonated with me as a librarian and an educator who approaches this work through the lens of data literacy, information literacy, and how those sort of competencies can be really important in decision making as both a consumer of information and a creator of information. And so I'll just give a couple of examples of where I think that comes into today's topic. And I've taken sort of an expansive view of what missingness is or what it means to be missing. And so there's a framework that I will often reference. It's the Association of College and Research Libraries Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education. There are a variety of different frames that you can use to teach and think about what it means to be information literate and develop those competencies. So when I'm engaging with a student or a researcher and answering their questions or understanding what their project goals are, this is something that I'm falling back on. So one of the frames is called information creation as a process. In terms of missingness as a consumer, that gets to some of what Jennifer was saying about really understanding the underlying characteristics of a data set, what information is there for you to evaluate and determine what is missing, what biases might exist, how were those data created so that you can make informed decisions about whether or not you're going to use it, and then also how you're going to report the use of that. Thinking about information creation as a process as a creator, the idea of if you're making choices about using particular data sets but not using others, or you're creating a data set, or you're making a map, you're contributing to missingness. Those choices are creating missingness. And so that's just an important thing to think about. There are areas of geography, critical cartography, critical GIS, where this concept is really important, that the choices that we make influence the message that a map is conveying and the decisions that might be made from that. So really parsing that out is important in the conversations that I have. There's another frame, information as value. As a consumer, this is like a great opportunity to talk about, well, what is being lost or what is potentially being lost when publicly available data sets no longer are publicly available or are being made available from several different sources because people in different groups are creating archival copies and making those available. So what does it mean for that source to have changed? What has gone missing and might not be available anymore? How can someone like me maybe help identify alternate sources? And then also, from the perspective of a creator, maybe there's good reason for information to be missing. Protecting privacy is a really good information for certain information, is a really good reason for certain information to be missing. And so, as you're creating methodologies that you're going to use to collect data about people or mobility, as you're thinking about presenting data that you've collected, what's the appropriate level of privacy protection that you might need to think about? And from an ethical standpoint, the last thing I'll say is, the data that I work with is spatial data. It's about location, but location is only one aspect. It's about the characteristics of that place. It's about the people that are associated with it. So there are a lot of ethical considerations that underlie the use of spatial data. That aren't always apparent to folks who maybe it's their first time doing it and their expertise is in a different field. So I'm always kind of working with people to tease out what are the choices that you should be making or should be thinking about at the very least in terms of using data, producing data, sharing data for spatial analysis and map making. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Josh. And Rebecca, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Rebecca Andridge. As Dana said, I'm a faculty in biostatistics here in the College of Public Health. And so as a biostatistician, I am generally a consumer and user of data. And really importantly, unlike Sarah, who sort of assumes or interrogates whether wants to have data on the whole population, I work with data where we definitely only have a sample, right? So even the US Census doesn't actually capture everybody, right? So what I work on in my methodology is methods for determining how different conclusions would be depending on what drives the missingness. So what has caused variables to be missing. So I started my career thinking about, you have a data set, and I mostly focus on large scale probability surveys where some of the questions have missing data. So thinking my sample is complete, but the responses to individual questions are incomplete. And in general, I work with data where we are asking humans questions. That's the type of data that I deal with. And so one of the things that happens when you ask people questions is there are some types of questions people don't like to answer, and they will not provide you an answer, and therefore you will have something that's missing. So sometimes missingness is innocuous, and it's like a flip of a coin, it was a fluke, they just skip the question, and that was the good world we'd like to be in. But I work in this space where the reason that you have this missing value is because somebody chose not to give you their answer because of what their answer would have been. So historically, the classical example I've always used is income. People don't, at certain ends of the income range, maybe are less likely to want to share what their income is. When I started as a grad student, that was the best example. Now, many, many years later, there are other even more salient examples, like asking someone about their political preferences, which you can't do on a federal survey, but you could do on your own survey, right? Where someone who self-identifies as a supporter of a certain candidate might be less likely to answer that question because of their answer to that question. So that's, in the world of missing data, is statisticians call that non-ignorable missing data, and that's where I live. And I think that one of the easiest ways to think about this is in standard methodology for analyzing data where there are holes. We think about this person who didn't answer this one question has a certain set of demographic characteristics. And if I substitute them with a different person with the same characteristics, but who did, we're assuming those two people are interchangeable. And it's a very standard assumption in missing data, but often that is not a good assumption, because the person who didn't answer the question about their vaccination status, but otherwise is demographically the same as this other person who did give their answer, the idea that mathematically we can effectively assume those are the same person in our estimates is a poor assumption. So that's the world that I live in, where we want to see how different would our estimates be if, in fact, the missingness is because of the underlying value. So when it comes to ethical challenges, there's loads of ethical challenges here, because fundamentally, if you are a statistician and you are using a model or a method that makes an assumption about what caused that missingness, you are probably making the wrong assumption. I mean, right? This seems likely that something is amiss. And so what I work in is the space where we do what are called sensitivity analyses, where we tweak we can think of it as the reason for the missingness to see how different things might be. So I think that there's the responsibility whenever there is missing data to interrogate it in that way. I mean, Jennifer was talking about this too. What's missing? Why is it missing? Many cases when it's people not giving answers, you will never know why it is not missing, but you can look at different assumptions and how conclusions change. I think another really important ethical challenge with missing data is the way we measure things sometimes causes missingness. So I like to think of this in examples that are relatively straightforward. So we are collecting data on humans and we have a question that asks about gender, or we have a question that asks about race. And these are these concepts that have to be categorized and put into check boxes, and we have to make a choice about how we put them down. And inevitably, everybody's not going to see themselves in a box on this form. So there's going to be measurement error, they're going to check the wrong box, or they're going to skip the question. So you're going to, inherent in how we're trying to measure things, there's going to be missingness that is caused. And it also then, on the flip side, when the data have already been collected, there's an ethical challenge of, okay, so I collected race in this beautifully detailed way, but so few people put themselves into these little categories that when I go to do my analysis, they don't get included. Because statistically, how do I handle a category that has two people? So you actually, as the analyst, are creating missingness. You're ejecting those individuals from your data set. And that is a huge ethical problem, right? Of we ask people to give us their time and their information, and we're going to, stick it in the garbage bin. That is obviously not okay. So there's a lot of ethics involved in the different ways that there can be missing data. And as a statistician, I actually thought Jennifer's presentation, where she had the slide of all the things you should be asking your data, and I said, yes, amen. That's what we try to get all of our students to do, is to question, what is the range of this variable? How many missing values are there? Right? We should always be looking at the data with that level of detail, just to think about missingness before you even get into any analysis.
Thank you so much to each of you. I think that we've gotten a lot of examples and creative ways in which to engage with the missingness of data. And we've sort of started to bring up some ethical issues that arise. And so let me sort of start with some questions that I've been thinking about. And again, anyone that is a member of the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to ask it in the Q&A button, and we'll get to those as well. So in some ways, I want to start, I want to center the question of ethics as sort of, front and center in thinking about our methodologies. And as each of you have sort of articulated, in some ways, I love how you said that, Rebecca, it's inherent in data, analyzing data, that it's imperfect or biased in different ways. That's just part of the research process or part of being a reporter. So no data set is perfect or complete, and researchers always have to make these conscientious decisions about how to analyze the data, how to report the data. And Josh, I really appreciate this, and Rebecca too, this idea that actually our decisions can contribute to the missingness, right? Both as we're both consumers and creators at the same time. So my question is just is there some line between these sorts of normal responsibilities that are inherent in research to just deal with the imperfect nature of data, and then going on to, the other side of the dilemma where it's oh, now the data is really not only imperfect, but problematic in certain ways. In some ways, maybe one of the ways of thinking about that question, Jennifer, is when is the missingness of the data the story itself, right? For research purposes as well for the journal. So do you think that there's a line there? Where things change when the data itself is not only imperfect, I guess. There's something more problematic. And if so, what are the ethical obligations that happen for researchers when you cross that line, if you think that that line sort of exists? I'm happy to open it up to anybody. I don't know. I don't know if like maybe I'll call on Jennifer first, and then anyone else who wants to share your thoughts.
I think one of the things we need to think about is, you know, is what I'm revealing in the data so important for people to know that I should still disclose it, but offer the caveats, and expertise from outsiders on what else could be there. I mean, there's some cases where it might be something that, it's so important to reveal that we do that. I mean, normally we try to find other sources or try to create data to fill in the blanks, but in some cases it might be important enough to reveal that, to tell that story that we might cross that line. And I know in countries where they don't have public data, there's no government databases. A lot of times some of the stories that they have to do, they have to make those decisions based on finding data other ways.
I have some thoughts about that if I could. I'm thinking about the current context. So one of the ways that data has been disappeared, has been made missing, is in the federal government removing gender markers from data. So data sets that had sort of complete measures, or I mean, not complete measures, but sort of broader measures of gender identity than a binary sex variable, the federal government is taking away those measures. But for most of those data sets, the addition of these broader measures of gender identity is relatively recent, so most of the federal surveys only measured men and women for centuries. And then we've had maybe a 5-year period or a 10-year period where we started to try to better capture people's social realities. And so I think as users, as a user, I do feel differently about that data where information has been deliberately removed versus data that simply ignored people's realities because we weren't paying attention or because we didn't value those identities. But I'm not sure that actually, I feel differently about that, but I'm not sure if that is different ethically. And in some ways, maybe it's easier to use data where I know information has been deliberately removed because I'm more aware of what might have been there or what should be there. But I think data can never catch up, sort of keep up with social reality. And so I don't think there's a sort of hard and fast line at which data becomes unusable, or not an easily identifiable line.
I think one of the challenges is, as a statistician, I'm always laughing about the fact that the general populace they can sort of understand a number. They have no idea about variability, right? So if you're going to present something that is based on an incomplete source, and there absolutely might be reason, but that's a huge challenge. I'd love to know how the journalist does it, right? How do you present this in a way that the take-home message that the person remembers isn't, 12% of people, whatever it is. There was some statistics making the round about the percentage of millennials who live with their parents or something, and it was based on some total garbage, but all anybody remembered was that 75% or something. So how do you, if you're going to present something that is flawed in some way because of some sort of missingness, how do you convey that uncertainty in a way that the lay public is going to understand? That's a huge challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take maybe a little bit of a different perspective on this question. And so, like, one of the things I regularly deal with is we're living in such a data saturated environment that there's kind of an assumption going in that, well, these data will be available. So, like, I'll get questions about international data sets or historical data sets, kind of with the going into that with the assumption of, well, they're available now, so they must be available for these other places or these other times. And so one of the things that I think I caution against that mentality is the idea that just because a data set doesn't exist doesn't mean that it should exist, and that we can use new techniques to maybe create a data set that maybe we should or shouldn't do. So Jennifer, you gave a great example of using remotely sensed imagery to estimate grave sites. I think it was in Sudan was the example. Um, well, we could use remotely sensed imagery for all sorts of things, but the ethical code of GIS, the ethical code of disciplines, I'll just bring up the example of archaeology is archaeological sites are legally and ethically protected for a reason. So even though we might be able to use technologies to create a data set that would disclose those locations, you first have to start with the ethics of like, are these data missing for an ethical or legal reason? And if they are, well, then it don't produce the data set, right? So I would say that first interrogating the why of the missingness in that framework is an important thing to do, because then you can kind of determine your own next steps of using or choosing not to use some particular data set.
Thank you, Josh. That actually like leads really into this next question that I've just been grappling with a lot. And we've been talking a little bit of this sort of intentional disappearing of data, but also the risks of actually putting data out there, or even if it's publicly available data, like social media data, the systematicity of creating a data set that is available and searchable and usable carries with it certain risks, right? So, some political contexts, including right now, make collecting data risky, either for the researchers themselves, but also for the individuals and communities that from which the data are being collected. And so these risks may result in this sort of incomplete missingness of data sets that we have to attend to, but they might also result in elevated risks for communities. So, I mean, Josh, you just asked the sort of like, we should interrogate the why is this missing in the first place? I would love to hear from any of you, like, how can researchers, journalists navigate these new risks that are arising when data collection and sharing is becoming more ethically fraught for participants, for researchers, for communities?
Maybe I can just start. So the theme of this year's Love Data Week is where's the data? This question, I think, really aligns with last year's theme, which was whose data is it anyway? And I think the starting point for this is like the idea of data ownership and what's who or what is portrayed in the data, right? As academics, we might be looking at, well, I'm collecting a data set and I'm the owner of that data. And the risks for me are someone finds out that I'm studying a topic that maybe today is not something that people would think is a priority topic or should be studied. But what are the risks for the subjects of the data? So like there are obviously things in place, institutional review boards and those things to kind of work out some of those issues. But I think that for me is like the most important question is what are the risks to me as a researcher versus what are the risks to the subjects and thinking about that when prioritizing decisions about what to share, what not to share, how to consult with the communities that are participants in this research, so that those decisions aren't being made in a vacuum.
I think another thing, when we're trying to measure people, humans in these fraught environments, it's really important to ask yourself what you are measuring and if you have to be measuring it, and because you could be increasing risk just by nature of the questions. And it could be that it's I always have that on my survey is not a good answer, right? Just because you always ask about marital status or whatever the heck it is, if it's not relevant to why you are collecting the data and what the data are going to be used for, you have to be really careful because and I hate to use this word, but if you collect it, it could then be weaponized by somebody else, right? So you need to ensure that the way you are collecting the data from this biased sample or in this risky situation aligns with how you're going to use it, and you're not opening the door by asking other stuff just because you always asked, historically, that other stuff.
And I'll say, I mean, speaking to the current moment and the current sort of political moment, the US federal government collects a lot of data from citizens, some of which is sort of for research purposes and some of which is for the functioning of the government, if you think about tax data or things like that. And those data, on the one hand, are owned or should be owned by the American people. And on the other hand, are very carefully protected for very obvious reasons. And there's, an extremely rigorous process at the federal government for determining, as Rebecca said, what are we collecting? Why do we actually need to be collecting this information? And so, I'll put in a plug for the Federal Statistics Research Data Center, which is a means of using those data in a very carefully protected and responsible and way with a lot of oversight from a lot of different people. But if we're thinking about concerns of missing data taken by government actions, I think we should also be very concerned about data which is being revealed and used in ways that might not be ethical. It's sort of by design difficult to connect people across different kinds of federal data collections to collect your tax data to your health data. And if government systems are making it easier to connect those two things, that has some potentially concerning implications that we should all be paying attention to.
I can go real briefly. Thanks. This is really a great discussion. I'm like furiously taking notes from what everyone is saying, so it's wonderful. I think, for newsrooms, there was, a period of time, I think, where like, oh, we got this data, let's make it searchable and put it online. I think that was a very problematic period because no one was thinking about the long-term implications of that data being out there. And there's lots of ways, we can put, like, if that data will lead to, changes being made or programs being fixed, I think that's one thing. But the notion of, oh, it's just cool and I can put it out there, I think that's something we have to be really careful about. And to Rebecca's earlier point, so I worked in a newsroom where I heard the term, huffalump. So once a fact is like out there, it's very hard to pull back. And they use the term huffalump from Winnie the Pooh because it just keeps showing up. And I think it's a really important question to think about to like prevent that from ever being out there in the first place. So I really appreciate this discussion. Thanks.
So one thing that has come up in some of what people have mentioned is sort of engaging community. Jennifer, you talked about so checking with readers and the people being interviewed or the data being collected. And Josh, you also mentioned the collaborative like enterprise of non-governmental entities right now trying to fill gaps of data that's no longer available or no longer being collected federally. So I just want to hear from each of you, like how you imagine potential collaborative opportunities with communities or with other researchers to reimagine data that is at risk of disappearing. Sarah, you're nodding a lot, so I'm going to let you go.
I'm actually nodding a lot, like not because I have good things to say about this, because just I have a lot of thoughts to say about it. I mean, I think part of the challenge of the kind of scale of data that demographic data often is that it's very hard to think about communities, about a sort of bottom-up grassroots effort to preserve those data. I mean, certainly communities can be very valuable in sort of demonstrating the value of data that's gone missing. And I think I have a lot of questions, if we think about a community of researchers, I have a lot of questions about ethical navigation of that, and maybe some of the librarians can help us work through this of, if I get a data set, I sign a user agreement with the providers of the data set to say, I'm not going to share this with other people. I'm only going to use it for my own research. How do I think about that obligation if that data set is taken away, not for any apparent reason, but sort of access is withdrawn or errors are introduced to these data? Do I then have am I still bound by the agreement that I signed, or do I have a different kind of ethical obligation to the research community or, to the people who gave their information to the data to make that available? And I don't have a good answer to that. So I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about it.
I don't think I have a very good answer to that either. I mean, that is one of those situations where, yeah, I don't know. It's sort of, in some ways, this moment feels a little bit unprecedented in terms of some of the data that are missing and the mobilization of the communities to try to archive um, what are being considered at-risk data. So I think, yeah, that's one that I'm interested to hear what others think too, but definitely something to think more about. I hadn't really thought about it that way previously. I'll just say when I was thinking about collaboration in this question, and I'll try to share a couple links through the chat, but there's two different ways of thinking about collaboration with communities here. One is I mentioned sort of the mobilization of these communities, research communities, professional organizations, libraries and archives who are trying to preserve data and websites that have uh, started to become more at risk or gone completely missing. And there's also the collaborating with the community from whom you're collecting data. So it's not a from whom with extraction kind of relationship and more of a with whom, collaborative, developing, mutually beneficial research where they have a stake in the decision making and what happens with those data and making ethical decisions in conjunction with those communities. And so I think both of those are important aspects of collaboration. And I'll try to pass a few links through the host here in a minute to highlight those. But there's another event coming up on Thursday specifically about the latter, the local data, local impact kind of community collaboration, highlighting some OSU projects.
Just quickly, I mean everything we do is a collaboration because we're having to like find experts to talk to, find, the communities affected by data. Um, so we're always dealing most of the time with public data, but I think there's lots of opportunities to collaborate with communities. And most of the examples I can think of are environmental data sets where there's no longer air monitors in the community, and working with scientists to place new air monitors and gather data that might be important for the community. So I think there's, soil collection for lead testing of soil. So I think there's opportunities to work with communities on some projects like that.
So I'm going to sort of move into some audience questions. There's some great questions that in some ways are some follow-up questions to things that we've already mentioned, but in making us see if there's like lines to draw. So Levi Dolan and also an anonymous attendee have asked in some ways a similar question. So what criteria would make findings so important that we need to reveal them? And at what point, this is another question, at what point should a researcher actually scrap the data if they realize that too much is missing, or maybe that the finding is not that important, right? So that's sort of like a question if there are some metrics. And I mean, one way I was thinking about relating this to the last point that we've been thinking about when it comes to collaboration. I mean, only today, I think ProPublica released these like letters that children were writing from Dilley, uh, the encampment in Texas. And I mean, one thing that is interesting is like there's a lot of identifiable information about those letters, right? And also it's like the people are sort of throwing bottles with like information from these different encampments about like data related to their situation. And in some ways, I mean, I feel like that is sort of a crux right there, where it seems like there's a lot that makes people vulnerable with this data being publicly shared. But also, it seems really important that they're the generators of the data. So, I mean, I just wonder, I mean, that's just one case. It's a case in my mind from this morning, but it does feel like a case where some of these issues of when, what are the criteria for thinking about how important is it to reveal or to share or to analyze this data kind of come up to me, for me at least. I don't know if that's a useful case, but just sort of one place to sort of start thinking about the missingness and the importance of and the vulnerability that it places on people.
I can speak a little bit. I mean, the example you just talked about is a really good example. I think the importance of having that out there is, and a lot of the letters are just the first name, but I did see some that are like the full name. Um, is this information available somewhere else anyhow? So am I disclosing something that, is public anyhow and it isn't going to make a difference? But also, there's so much of this data that like we can't humanize. And I think projects like this where we're actually like seeing the humans behind the data is really, really important. They did another project a few years ago where they asked people who were in unhoused people in encampments to write down what things were taken. And I think it's just like really powerful, prescriptions like family members' ashes, like it really like humanized the story in a way that you couldn't in any other way, I think.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just going to say, so for this idea of how much missingness is too much missingness is a question I'm asked all the time, right? My response rate is X. Is that okay? Is actually the question I'm asked a lot of the time. And I would say that from a statistical point of view, so we're talking about like there are holes in your data or people dropped out of your study or something, not the broader issue of who are we measuring, right? So narrowing it down. I think if you are analyzing the data correctly, then there should be this added level of uncertainty that gets injected because of the fact that there's this large amount of missingness, right? So, and that can be hard. First of all, missing data methods are complicated, and complete case analysis is what the software does by default. And so, and maybe that's okay if you are very transparent about that this has happened, but better is to have these built-in frameworks that force you to do that extra work of the what if and the analysis that asks the question of what if everybody had responded in a certain way, what if, how different would my conclusions be? And so that you are the uncertainty is propagated. Again, after I just said nobody understands uncertainty, there's sort of it's sort of comical to say, but you should account for the uncertainty. But there isn't a magic number because even different measures on your survey could have different amount of bias depending on at the same response rate, because different things, there's different reasons for missingness for different variables, and they're associated with demographics differently. So it's just such a complicated thing that the federal government has stated thresholds. 80% response rate or lower, you have to do a non-response bias analysis. 70% or lower for an item, you have to do the analysis. But I mean, those aren't really, and they're not really good thresholds because you could have a lot of bias at a 90% response rate, or you could have no bias at a 50% response rate. It's really so item specific. So to sum that up is there is no answer to when is too much. The only answer is no missingness is good.
Sarah, did you want to add something to this sort of question about missingness and like when we should scrap data?
I guess the thing that I'm thinking about, and I think, I mean, the way you framed the question, Dana, and also Jennifer's response sort of highlighted this. I mean, I think there are, as an academic and a researcher studying these questions, it's a little bit different set of evaluations than a journalist might have, or that other, in some sense, yes, advancing knowledge is a great cause, but like, is there ever a case where advancing knowledge for the sake of knowledge is more important than protecting vulnerable people? It's sort of harder to make that case than in a maybe more forward-facing, public-facing journalism approach where there's a different set of trade-offs.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, and so another question that comes from an anonymous attendee is, so I'm going to read the question and I'm going to add one more like wrinkle to it. So this is related to the point made that we need to be mindful of what the data we collect and how it might be used downstream. I'm interested in genomic databases that are linked with the data of electronic medical records and social science survey data. The point of these databases is to make the data available for future research. So data is collected under broad consent. How should database developers and repositories and researchers use and think about the ethical uses of this data. And one thing that I want to sort of highlight is one of the sort of really powerful things we can do to sort of address the missingness of data is to link up different data sets together in ways that people didn't necessarily consent to when the data was being collected. And so how should we think about how to maintain it and its sort of ethical use moving forward when it's publicly or at least available for future research? And maybe, Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot since you're the librarian, and then if anyone else wants to add anything to thinking through that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough one because part of the issue is that you can't necessarily anticipate what those future uses will be when you are developing those consent questions and developing products. And so I think it's really important at the planning stages of a given project to really try to tease out as much as you can, especially if you're dealing with any potentially sensitive data, sort of tease out as much as you can about what are the risks and what are the reproducible types of analyses you might have in mind for a given project, and what be very clear about what participants did or did not consent to, so that researchers who encounter that information in the future will have a really good understanding of what were the underlying creation processes for these data and who were the participants. I'm going to try to share another link really quickly, but this is something that's coming up in geospatial data science more and more, especially with the advent of AI, this idea that we're going to be producing data sets that can be, we want to document for reproducibility purposes, but future reproducibility might be using models that don't exist today. And what does that mean? And so there's this relatively new resource called the Data Ethics Toolkit that's specifically geospatial focused, but that might have some applicability in other areas too. So I'll just share this, and maybe there are other disciplines that are developing things like these, but this is just the one that I know about in my area.
Thanks, Josh.
I'll just add that I think historically we've been very bad at accountability as academics, that a lot of our sort of ethical protections for data really depend on the presumption that individual actors have good intent and good faith and are trying to follow ethical guidelines. And there aren't good things in place to deal with people who are acting in bad faith and not interested in following ethical guidelines. And so, I mean, I think we see that challenge in a lot of domains in universities and in research, but I think that's maybe becoming even more pressing to sort of think about accountability as a field and what do we do to people who don't maintain these standards.
One final question from the audience is about oversight and sort of how institutions can support researchers. So can you provide any helpful tools or processes that IRBs, so Josh, you've provided a lot, so thank you, but in general, like tools or processes that IRBs can use to identify projects that may have these like added ethical issues related to missing data? Or is this the responsibility of researchers themselves to do it, and it's not necessarily the purview of the IRB to handle these sorts of challenges? So, Rebecca, maybe I'll have you go first.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a hard question. So for certain types of studies, there could be, for example, a data safety monitoring board, right? So I sit on a data safety monitoring boards for many studies, and one of our most important things is we're interrogating missingness, right, and asking why, and that includes at the data that have been collected and why, and dropout. It includes recruitment and who's getting in, and so there's sort of there's types of studies where that is baked in and is sort of easier. But your sort of standard secondary data analysis or observational, something where you're not you don't have that oversight baked in. I don't know how an entity like the IRB can insert themselves in there, because you would be going down a wormhole, and it's not as if at the time of IRB approval you know the answer to how much missingness is there, and that's a really hard challenge. So I think it really does lie on the researchers. And then in terms of dissemination, there should be a responsibility of the journals, or wherever it is that there should be rules about transparency and reporting response rates, and being very clear about these things at that point of dissemination, at least in the academic journals where it can be sort of, I'll air quote, controlled a little bit. I have a hard time seeing how an IRB really can get its hands messy with this missingness issue.
Well, we are out of time, and I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful, responses, your rich examples, and the ways in which you've been sort of navigating these issues. I mean, one thing that I'm hearing that has come up a lot is the fact that the data is about people. It's ultimately about humans and thinking about our responsibility to the people, and sort of having fidelity to respecting them. That is not only about people, it's also about our environment and our communities and our world. But that seems like that was something that came up a lot that I think is a really useful heuristic moving forward. So thank you so much, Jennifer, Rebecca, Sarah, and Josh for sharing. And please, audience members, go to other Love Data Week conversations that are happening throughout OSU this week. Bye, everyone.